Greetings to everybody, and a great thank you to the organizing committee of the 18th Congress of the ISFNR for inviting me to deliver this keynote address. The title of my paper is Absent Emotion, Extreme Action, and Ultimate Justice. And before I start, I will share my screen with you. Some tales haunt me. One tale has haunted me for 2 decades because I did not understand why anyone composed and narrated this tale. Since it is a very short tale, I will share it with you in the words of its collectors and translators, William Crook and Ram Garib Chaube. There were 4 sons to an old woman. One day they said to her, "Mother, we want to search our livelihood in another country." The mother granted their request. The 4 left their home, and as they were passing through a narrow street, the wall of a certain house fell upon them, and one of the 4 died instantly. The remaining 3 then went further, and as they were bathing in a tank, a crocodile jumped over them and bore away one of the 3. The remaining 2 then went still further, and as they were passing through a thick forest, a wild buffalo attacked them and killed one of the 2 on the spot. The 4th then returned home. His mother asked him, "What about the world?" The son replied, "Ek daha mahal ke bheet." The one died by the fall of the wall of a certain palace. The mother said, "Du labra, thou liar. Ek ko le gaya magra." The one was borne away by a crocodile, was the son's reply. The mother said, "Aisa, is it so?" Ek ko le gaya bhaisa was the answer. That is, one was taken away by the buffalo. The mother became disheartened and said, "I? What?" The son replied, "Main aur tain, thou and I." What is the story here? Is it not just a series of events which are not even causally connected? The tale seems to be an evidence of everything that Max Luthi said about the folktale. Tragic events in folktale are narrated without the slightest indication of physical or psychological distress, and we hear no cry of pain. We are not told why the brothers want to leave their old mother alone or why she permits them. Death of the 3 brothers happens without a warning and without a moment of reflection on the part of the survivors. When the last one is left alone, he returns. When his mother sees him, first of all, she asks him about the world, and he answers with the news of the first brother's death, and then so on. Max Luthi would say, quotes open, "In its essence and in every sense, the folk tale lacks the dimension of depth. Its characters are without substance, without inner life, without an environment. They lack any relation to past and future, to time altogether." Quotes close. Max Luthi and many other folk narrative scholars have reflected upon the fact that in the folk narrative, events happen, events that should evoke a strong emotional response. But instead of the emotional response, the event is followed by action. One brother dies, the others continue on the journey. And if this tale is not well known, then other well-known tales share its characteristics. At best, we are told that the character was happy or sad or fearful or lonely or proud, but not many words are devoted to the description of the emotional state of the character. It is as if folk narrative does not know emotions beyond identifying words, or does not care for the emotional state of its characters. What matters is what one does and how one moves on. Poverty does not lead to sadness, but propels the character to go on a journey. A threatening situation does not lead to brooding over it, but making a pact with an animal or supernatural being to get out of it. And yet, the folk narrative ends in an emotional state. The famous ending of Happily Ever After is a state of everlasting happiness. Other tales end in sadness, and yet others leave the recipient to interpret the emotional nature of the ending. This does not make sense. If the folk narrative avoids delving into emotion throughout, then why does it end in an emotion? It is this question that compels us to reconsider the so-called absence of emotion in the folk narrative, and before that, to ask, what is emotion? How has it been intellectually and philosophically conceptualized in recent scholarship, and can the folk narrative relate to those concepts? In this paper today, I'm going to reflect upon 1, the place of emotion in folk narrative, 2, the relationship between emotion and action, and 3, the folk narrative's quest for morality and justice. I argue that these 3 are interlinked factors, and together they reveal the folk narrative's poetics of emotion. I will be specifically referring to Indo-European folk narrative on the basis of Grimm's folk tales compiled in the early 19th century in Germany, and Indian folk tales compiled by William Crook and Ram Garib Chaube in late 19th century India. Theories of emotion can be broadly divided into 2 categories. 1, the feeling theory, and 2, the cognitive theory. The feeling theory was first articulated by Descartes in his work, Passions of the Soul. As per this theory, feeling is central to the emotion, and feelings are triggered in human beings by external or internal stimuli, but are not consciously produced. Each emotion is different from the other on the basis of feelings. Quotes open. Thus, anger, fear, sadness, or resentment are differentiated on the basis of each emotion's distinctive feeling. Quotes close. That's Newbery. The feeling theory considers feelings and therefore emotions to be beyond the control of human beings, but postulates that the consequences of these emotions can be controlled. So anger may not be vented directly and may be controlled by the individual. It recognizes the fact that it may not always be possible to control feelings and their consequences. There is consensus that feelings arise by themselves, but the issue is whether they can be controlled. This theoretical question itself is the subject of folk narrative. I am reminded of a very short tale from the Crook and Chaube collection of Indian tales, which is about anger. The story is called Testing a Jogi. A man decides to test a jogi. A jogi is an ascetic, and ascetics are expected to have conquered their emotions or are not expected to be swayed by emotion. So the man goes to a jogi and asks for fire. The jogi says he does not have any. The man repeatedly asks for the fire, and the jogi keeps losing his cool. Finally, on being asked for the 4th time, he gets totally angry and runs with a stick towards the man. The man runs away laughing and saying, "Now the fire is really burning." The story engages with the theoretical question, is it possible to control emotions? It highlights the difficulties involved in the management of emotions. Humor, playfulness, and irreverence are other emotions that are part of this story, but never identified as such. The second theory of emotions is the cognitive theory. Although it is not one single whole and has many different schools of thought within, but the underlying commonality is that emotions are connected to other beliefs and perceptions. Comparatively speaking, the feeling theory considers the subject to be a more passive recipient of feelings than the cognitivists. As for the cognitive theory, beliefs and perceptions are social in nature and form the larger framework within which the individual takes cognizance and experiences emotions. So to feel anger, one has to know that this is something to be angry about. To feel resentment, one has to participate in a larger set of beliefs. For the cognitive theory, emotions do not arise in a vacuum, but are located within the larger perception of the individual. For example, to feel devotion, one must have a concept of the divine. To feel patriotic and be willing to die for one's nation, one must believe in the idea of the nation. Regarding the control over emotions, quotes open, cognitivists grant a much broader range of control. Quotes close, that's Newbery again. As individuals can, quotes open again, control their cognitive states, quotes close. For example, one can change one's beliefs under newer influences. Cognitivists differ on the question whether emotions can be directly controlled. Some do believe that emotions cannot be controlled. According to them, perception may change, but it may still not change one's emotion. For example, knowing that smoking is bad for health may not reduce the feeling of relief or relaxation derived from smoking. Other cognitivists postulate that we choose our emotions. For example, knowledge about the functioning of the dairy industry might induce one to become vegan. Folk narrative would justify the cognitivist too, as in this story. A king goes out at night in disguise to get a real hang of the situation of his people. He meets a thief and agrees to assist him in his robberies that night. Thief is a master in breaking into rich traders' houses. He enters the first one, but comes out empty-handed, saying that he accidentally ate salt in the house and is therefore obliged to be loyal to the owners. Enters the second house, comes out empty-handed, saying he overheard the man talking to his wife about their savings not being enough for their daughter's wedding and felt compassion and did not ruin the man. Enters the third house and comes out with nothing because he's the owner agonizing over the difference of a single paisa or penny or cent in his accounts of the day and wonders what would happen to him if his entire wealth is stolen from him. He pitied the man. By then, dawn is about to break, so he suggests to his assistant that they should rob the state treasury and does so without guilt. Next day, the king, in his actual role, summons the thief and declares him to be the most honest man of his kingdom. The thief's emotions make him behave in the manner he does because he shares certain cultural idioms with those who he is stealing from. For example, his commitment to the belief that one does not betray those whose salt one has eaten, or his compassion for a daughter's father. These are received values that the thief, as a member of a certain society and not as a thief, has received. He chooses his emotion instead of being subject to it. So he is valued, while an ascetic with uncontrolled emotions is laughed at. More generally, scholars of emotion are concerned with connections between emotions and physiological and behavioral response, or with perceivability of emotions. Folk narrative does not avoid the physiological response of emotions, but does not always delve into it much. Behavioral response, however, is almost always recorded, and that is what we call action in the story. Scholars also think that folk psychology cannot reveal the internal nature of emotions, as neuroscience and experimental psychology can. Neuroscientists have also researched whether emotions are pan-cultural and found that the basic emotions, anger, sadness, happiness, fear, surprise, and disgust, are pan-cultural. The spread of folk narrative across boundaries or similarities in tales across linguistic and cultural boundaries supports the argument for pan-cultural nature of emotions. The list of basic emotions for folk narrative, however, is longer and includes love, hatred, and bravery. Related to the above discussion are the concepts of emotional truth and moral emotions, proposed by philosopher Ronald de Souza. Emotional truth refers to the connection between emotion and reality. If one's fear comes true, then one is likely to believe that emotion of fear was indicating the way reality will unfold. Hope coming true will encourage individuals to remain hopeful. stay positive, as it is said. D'Souza's concept of moral emotions is concerned with the question whether emotions are moral. In the philosophical tradition, for Stoics, emotions had no moral value. But for Aristotle, moral education meant learning to feel, quotes open, right emotion to the right degree at the right time, quotes close. For other philosophers, certain emotions are moral, like compassion and sympathy, while others, like jealousy or resentment, are not. D'Souza expands Aristotle's view through his work. He asks two related questions. One, whether emotions are totally natural or socially constructed. For D'Souza, it is a combination of the two, and a utopian state of harmony between the natural and social emotions can lead to bliss, but not morality. Because morality is complex while emotions are simple. Morality aims to be universal, but cannot always be. For example, compassion for one may not be compassion for another. His second question is, can emotions produce knowledge? According to axiological hypothesis, emotions are viewed as one of the modes of perception and therefore seen as knowledge. They give us knowledge of value of things, facts, or situation. Emotions also show us the value system of the society, and no value system is possible without emotions. D'Souza integrates the different perceptions and says, quotes open, we need to look to the triple origin of each emotion in biology, social conditioning, and individual biography, quotes close. D'Souza's position is, quotes open, if our emotions are both defendant, judge, and jury in moral matters, then true moral progress is emotional progress, governed by a regulative ideal of fully comprehensive, adequate emotional response, quotes close. The story of the thief again illustrates the point that D'Souza is making. The story is saying that a thief may not be a man of immoral emotions, that in spite of being a thief, he may have a sense of honesty, compassion, and pity, all moral emotions. In the end, the king defines the thief as a man of high morals, confirming the theory that emotions form the basis of morality. Now let us work with a Grimm's tale that has an emotion in its title itself and see what is its emotional truth and what kind of knowledge does it produce. This is tale number 121 in the 1837 edition of Kinder und Hausmärchen, titled The Prince Who Does Not Fear Anything. The title includes an emotion, fear, as missing from a person's self. So the story is about what can happen when someone is not afraid of anything. We are told right in the beginning that the hero does not like or is not happy in his parental home. If happiness is an emotion, so is unhappiness. The first emotion, therefore, in the story is unhappiness. The combination of the missing emotion, fear, and the present emotion, unhappiness, motivate him to go out in the world and seek new experiences. On his way, he rests in front of the house of a giant. Seeing huge balls and a bat, he starts to play with them. The unsaid emotions are relaxation and playfulness. Giant comes out and is surprised to see an ordinary human being playing with his balls. Pun is not intended, it's in the text itself. As readers, we now learn that absence of fear causes the hero to be extremely capable. The giant challenges him to get the apple from the tree of life for no particular reason, so one can say he feels like challenging the man. The hero accepts for no reason or gain, so one can say he too feels like accepting. The giant tells him of many hurdles or tries to give him the emotion of fear. The hero declares that nothing can stop him, so it is obvious he feels confident. Sure enough, he finds the tree. There is a ring in front of the apple, and to pluck it, he must put his hand in the ring, which seems more like a bangle actually. and because it stays on his arm. Upon his return, he gives the apple to the giant, that is, expresses the emotion of loyalty. But he does not give the ring, or in other words, he is cautious. Along with the ring, the lion, who used to guard the tree of life, has also followed him, and thus he is now stronger. Yet he is cheated and has series of mishaps from which the lion rescues him, until he is able to return to the girl he had met near the tree of life, who heals his wounds with the water of life, and the story ends with the description of a happy wedding communal meal. If we look at the pattern of emotion and reason in the story, we see that they are like two interwoven strands. Emotions caused by external and internal factors become the cause of decisions and actions. Emotionally guided actions become the cause of relationships, good and bad, with other human and non-human beings. Finally, loyalty of an animal and love of another human heals the wounded body and soul, leading to happiness. Cognitive theory of emotion seems to be at work here. The story moves from a state of discontentment to a state of happiness via tests and trials of courage and loyalty. The emotional truth of the tale is that not only the presence of emotions causes action, but also the absence of an emotion, fear, causes action. The knowledge it produces is the absence of fear does not protect one from being hurt or from the need of other emotions. Yet, the story has not spent any words in describing emotions apart from mentioning the absence of fear in the beginning and then never again. On the surface, it was all about extreme action. Moreover, it is a story like many other stories across cultures, that a fearless or innocent or desperate person accepts tough challenges and fulfills them with the help of animals or supernatural beings, and consequently finds everlasting happiness. The folk narrative differs from Aristotelian premise, quotes, right emotion to the right degree at the right time, quotes close, in that there is no limitation of degree and emotion is usually expressed in extreme degree. The understanding that the folk narrative does not dwell on the emotional state of its characters is correct as long as it is based upon the consideration of the text, that is, on the words of the text. I define the folk narrative as text with a thin language of emotion, whose hypothetical opposite would be a thick language of emotion. The question is whether this thin language of emotion can define the emotional content of the folk narrative. I argue that this thin language of emotions is not a sufficient measure to understand the emotional content of the folk narrative. To understand and analyze the emotional quotient of the folk narrative, I propose shifting the gaze of our perception away from the text. Let us not look at the folk narrative text, but at the effect it produces in the recipients. I ask you, all recipients of folk narrative, do you not feel the sadness, desperation, and joy of the characters? Do you not feel sympathy for the child being ill-treated by a stepmother? Do you not rejoice or feel relieved when this child is able to break free of the abusive relationship? Are you unable to guess how the young woman in the blue beard would feel when she discovers that her husband has murdered all his previous wives? Do you not wonder at the moment of that discovery whether she will be able to escape a similar fate? Do you not enjoy when a fool is able to do what the intelligent cannot achieve? Do you not rejoice when a tyrant is brought down? I believe that the answer to all these questions would be yes. But if this method seems too subjective, look at all the visual representations of folk narrative, old and new ones. In spite of many conscious and unconscious changes by varied artists, the visual interpretation of folk narrative texts highlights the emotions those characters generate. radically new interpretations that sympathize with the villainous figures and try to explain their actions also do so by changing the emotional makeup of those characters. It is also on the basis of impact that the modern trade in folk narrative is possible. From books to films, folk narrative is taken up for production because its emotional efficacy is well proven. Indeed, something like Disneyland even provides a space where the embedded emotions of the fairy tale can be concretized in physical structures, hard currency, colors, and images. At yet another level, in life and in common discourse, pure joy is often seen as something which is possible only in the fairy tale. People try to momentarily achieve it, let's say, in a fairy tale wedding. The final reason for the importance of impact for analysis is this one. The art and craft of folk narrative is rooted in oral storytelling. And in oral storytelling, recipients are an integral part of the storytelling, as their response is immediately available for the storyteller. It is not simply a meaningless formula that storytellers often ask questions of their audience. The act is part of storytelling and allows the storyteller to understand whether he is achieving the desired impact. The aesthetics of the folk narrative developed within the context of orality. Therefore, it is only valid to include the effect on the recipients to interpret the emotional quotient of the folk narrative. It is on the basis of the feelings of the recipients that the folk narrative has made and kept its place in society. All these visible, invisible, and linguistic responses to fairy tale at the social level show that recipients respond emotionally to folk narrative, or that the folk narrative causes emotions to be experienced. And some of them are emotions experienced exclusively through the folk narrative. If the folk narrative hardly mentions emotions, then how come recipients feel the emotions? If we reconsider the Indo-European folk narrative, we will see that every story has at least one dominant emotion and many other emotions along the way. It is not necessary that the dominant emotion will drive the story, but its fulfillment will be achieved. Characters experience conflicting emotions, face emotional dilemmas, and need to make a decision in favor of one or the other. Complexity of emotions is not alien to folk narrative, and it engages with it. The good and evil in folk narrative is often not a character, but a moral or immoral desire or decision. Characters desire to have what is not theirs, experience greed, are ready to go out and do whatever it takes to fulfill their immoral desires. Heroes always fight those with immoral emotions and are themselves driven by moral emotions of compassion, loyalty, and love. There are also gray areas, for example, a justified revenge, as in the story of the rat catcher of Hamelin or the Pied Piper of Hamelin. The rat catcher rids the town of rats or does the job he has been assigned. But the employers do something immoral. They don't pay him. So he plays his pipe again, and this time, instead of the rats, children of the town follow him, and he disappears with them. The story leaves it at that and let the recipients decide whether the Pied Piper's actions are justified. The moral dilemma is for the audience: justice for the worker or compassion for the innocent children. Who would decide with? Either way, the final emotion of the story is sadness. At this point, I would like to return to the tale that has haunted me and that I cited in the beginning. Let us reconsider it, for it lacks any word of emotion. When I read the tale, which starts with an old woman whose 4 sons are going away to earn a livelihood, leaving her alone, They seem poor and desperate, and I sympathize with them. When the first brother dies, in the fourth sentence of the story, because a wall they are walking next to just collapses on him, I feel surprised, shocked. But his brothers just move on. When the second brother is snatched away by a crocodile while they are washing themselves at a pond, I feel sad. The rest too walk on through the forest. Then they are suddenly attacked by a wild buffalo and one is killed. The sense of tragedy or of destiny does not escape me. When the fourth returns and is about to tell his old mother, the pathos is unbearable. At the news of the first brother, the mother says, "You liar." She does not believe him, or in other words, is shocked and goes in denial mode. The son simply informs of the second death, and she says, "Is it so?" What can be understood from it except that she is dismayed and devastated? At the news of the third death, she says, "What?" The poor woman's sorrow is obviously beyond her own comprehension. The son says, "Thou and I." The story ends. What does the son say at the end? Does he console his mother that they still have each other? Or articulates the fact that only two out of the 5 members of their family are left? Considering the manner in which he has informed her, he seems like an emotional wreck himself. Anyhow, the storyteller has not given us a word of any emotion felt by anyone. So, how did I feel? Surprise, sadness, sorrow, and pathos or pity. The question to myself leads me to notice something about the folk narrative that might explain why it does not slow down from its action-oriented structure to ponder over emotions. Emotions which are undoubtedly connected with those situations. It seems to me that there are 2 reasons. One, the folk narrative expects an active engagement from its recipient. It does not imagine the recipient to be a passive character in need of being explicitly told when the characters of the story are feeling pain or joy or compassion or any other emotion. It expects the recipient to feel an emotion as an effect of the action or situation, or feel the emotional conflict and dilemma of the characters as their own. The fast action hits the recipient with emotion, at times with one emotion after another in quick succession. In the story of the 4 brothers, there are 2 emotions, surprise and sadness. One of the emotions, sadness, keeps increasing in intensity. From an everyday desperation to the ultimate pathos, it is just one emotion that gets intensified. No language of emotion, but just sequence of events which the characters are also passive recipients of. There is hardly any story there, no drama of many emotions, but it can leave the recipient's heart bleeding for these nameless characters. If this is also the emotion that the storyteller wanted the recipients to feel, then she or he or people have amazing art and craft of storytelling, and the story is totally successful. The story of the 4 brothers and their old mother seems to have been narrated by someone so that the most immoral of recipients may also experience compassion and sorrow for a moment. And now that I feel I understand it, it may not haunt me anymore. At least I hope. The second reason for the absence of an elaborate language of emotion seems to be located in the folk narrative's intense love of justice. Narratives are centered on a conflict and its resolution. Someone wronged has to be righted, and the wrongdoers have to be punished. It seems to me that every story is like a legal case that seeks to achieve justice at the end. The justice knows only ultimate forms. Those who are moral, have compassion, courage, loyalty, and love, win the case, and when they win, they get all the rewards they desired and more. They get everything. And above all, everlasting happiness. Those who are immoral, greedy, cruel, sadistic, and are possessed with hate are revealed in the end and lose the case. And when they lose, they get the highest form of punishment, death. And additionally, death may come in very gruesome forms. Interestingly, those who win gain happiness by becoming part of a community, and there are many people and animals in that final happy image. But those who are punished are banished. They suffer their punishment alone. Justice for the righteous is equal to happiness, is equal to multi-species community life. Justice for the wrongdoer is equal to sufferance, is equal to exile from community. Let us now juxtapose folk narratives' thin language of emotion, extreme action, and ultimate justice to the modern system of justice. In criminal adjudication, quotes open, emotion is unalterably opposed to reason and thus to justice itself. That is from Samuel Pillsbury. The justice system does not ponder over emotions of the victims or the perpetrators of crimes. It takes note of the evidence and events that took place and comes to a decision who was right or wrong. Emotions are experienced by all who are involved in the case, and several crimes, like crimes of passion or hate crimes, are based on cognitively constructed emotions. But the legal case must proceed on the basis of facts or actual events. The folk narrative too narrates what happened using a thin language of emotion. In the light of this similarity between the folk narrative and the modern system of justice, one sees that the folk storytellers are narrating cases of injustice and attainment of justice and intend to convince the recipients through the narration of events, sounds a thick language of emotion. In West Africa, tales were actually cited during legal proceedings, like the way articles of law are cited by the lawyers. Talking of European folk narrative, Jack Zive says, quotes open, they expose untruth, and the best are bare, brusque, and concise, quotes close. Benkel Zenger, or the bench singers, provide another example to show the relationship between folklore and justice. They were German folk singers who hung around 19th century courts, gathering stories and turning them into narrative songs illustrated with pictures. Whatever happened in the courts, but in their songs, justice for the weak, the wronged, was always attained. Within the folk narrative, it is an oft-repeated trope that characters land up before a king or judge to have their dispute settled. Good and bad judges are also characters of the folk narrative. Additionally, the pedagogic value of folk narrative in teaching the concepts of the right and wrong, good and bad, has been well realized and used. Proceeding from these facts, folk narrative could be seen as a poetic narrative in legal style by the folk storytellers. What makes the folk narratives different from legal cases is their use of fantasy, wonder, and magic. The conflict is often realistic, but justice is often acquired through fantastic means. Justice is also acquired with help from other species or by trick. This difference relates to one of the many roles of the folk narrative and one of the many roles that folk narrative plays in the lives of its recipients. And this role is providing hope beyond the realistic possibilities. Considering that folk narrative thematizes the struggle of the deprived, the marginalized, and those unable to move the system in their favor, poetic justice is supremely important. The aim of the folk narrative is to create a sense of comprehensive justice that, That is legal, emotional, moral, ethical, and social justice. The attainment of comprehensive justice fills the inner and the outer space with the emotion of eternal happiness. In this process, poetic justice of folk narrative becomes people's discourse and understanding of justice. To conclude, I would say that folk narrative is essentially an emotional narrative. Theoretical and philosophical considerations regarding emotions find reflection in old and new stories. But at an overall level, emotion and reason or rationality are entwined in folk narrative and not separated as in post-Enlightenment modern discourse. To analyze emotions in folk narrative, turning our gaze away from the text of the folk narrative to its effect on the recipients, lets us revisit the text and reconsider the interpretation that folk narrative lacks emotional expression. The absent emotion, extreme action, and ultimate justice function together and make the recipients, the listener, or the reader a part of the story. The recipient becomes another character who feels and wonders why the other characters do not feel. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everyone. I just want to thank you, Professor Sadhana Naithani, for her systematic, thoughtful, and stimulating lecture entitled Absent Emotion, Extreme Action, and Ultimate Justice. Just me repeat technical instructions. Those who want to continue to follow this discussion and post questions by chat, please stay on this Vimeo channel, while those who want to participate in live conversation and ask video question must log out of this Vimeo channel and re-enter Zoom meeting at the next link or next button, join live conversation. Here in Zoom room, you can also post questions by chat option or by raising hand. Sadhana, your lecture is a wonderful follow-up of yesterday's lecture by Jan Plumper and discussion of how folklore studies can contribute to transdisciplinary field of emotion research in epistemologically relevant way. I especially thank you for your systematic review of theories of emotions and feelings, starting from Aristotle to the Canadian philosopher Ronald de Seuss, that go along with basic folklorist conclusions or intuitions. I have no doubt that this important lecture will raise a lot of questions and comments, and I'm privileged to pose the starting one. So if I understood correctly your fine argumentation, folk tales with their thick language of ethical quest for morality and ultimate justice and thin language of emotional expression seem to reflect universal human condition and satisfy universal needs, aspirations of human beings, regardless of sociocultural conditions in which these tales are retold, reinterpreted by recipients. But how this thesis to reconcile with folklorist knowledge that aesthetical and ethical adaptations of folk tales, as well as repertoire itself, change over time in each society. And given that you are well acquainted with both European and Indian history of transmission and written adaptations of folk tales, and their adjustment to literary canons, to cultural or religious norms of the time, can you tell us or just give some example of how changes in value and ethical systems coincide with the changes of ideas that collectors and editors of important folk conditions have about what does it mean to present ideal folk narrative?
Thank you, Renata. Thank you very much for that comment. And thank you for reminding us of yesterday's Keynote by Jan Plemper. And I also thought that there were a lot of interconnections between what he was talking and what we are talking as folk narrative scholars. Now, your question to me about the universality of emotions and the universality of tales, I'm hardly proposing it. I think it is there in several kinds of literature. And right from the beginning in folklore scholarship, it has been there. Several 19th century scholars grappled with when they found similarities in world tales. As with colonialism, tales from all over started becoming available to metropolitan readers. Then the similarities were obviously there, and they have to be grappled with. And we know that theoretically they were grappled with by somebody like Theodore Benfey, saying India is the homeland of the old folk narrative, or other theories. And equally, other colonial collectors, the British collectors in India, for example, always speaking against it and saying, no, these similarities do not mean that India is the homeland of folk narrative. What they do mean, however, is that human beings have similar emotions all across the world. Further on, I also feel that this, science would also say that, there are emotions are common to all people, the same emotions. But I think the expression of emotions is embedded in ethical and social structures, in cultural structures, so to say, in one word. And that expression, it both connects and makes spaces unique. So folk tales, folk narrative has traveled, it has been adapted. When we talk of variations, we are talking of adaptability, but for adaptability to take place, there has to be some similarity at the core of it. Otherwise, adaptation is not possible, because understanding would not be possible. So yes, in some ways, I think as far as emotions are concerned, their universal nature is established. And folk narratives, I think, establish the way different cultures, different peoples deal with those emotions, what they make out of it, and how they actually express it. So this is neither to confirm or not to deny the theory, but to say that universality of emotions and universal structures, which are very different in their specifics, combine actually to create folk narrative, which finds similarity and differences across borders. So I hope in some ways I have kind of addressed your question. But if not, I'm here for more.
If there are no questions by audience, I could just add, there are some, but just to add, do you consider demands, for example, for feminist retellings of fairy tales justified, in the sense that they are also a kind of revitalization of fairy tales in modern context, because they are, for example, demanding to turn escapist overtones of some fairy tales into more, as to say, revolutionary tone, or more like appropriate to aspirations of modern girls and boys.
Feminist interpretations of tales are, for me, part of various other ideological interpretations of tales, also consciously ideological. All adaptations in some way have some form of ideology at its core, but interpretations are possible and all interpretations are valid. But I think as far as the creative content of the interpretations are concerned, feminist interpretations, since you're asking specifically about it, I think as far as the creative content of that is concerned, that varies from one interpretation to another, from one text, one author to another. At times it seems a little imposed from outside, but at times it really brings out the elements which are embedded in the tales, which are at the core of it, but we are not able to actually see them. So I think that creative content obviously varies as per the authors and the text. But yes, on an overall level, I would say it is as valid as other interpretations, because folk narrative, I think, is very open to interpretations.
Thank you, Sadhana. We have 3 questions or comments in the row. First, Christina Bakilega, Evelina Rudan, and then Swati Sutkaran. Please, Christina, unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you, Sadhana. This was a wonderful, wonderful talk. And in part for me, it explained the problem I was having with my own paper, where I kept thinking, oh, I'm talking about the emotion of a character here, then I'm talking about the emotion of a narrator, then I'm talking about the emotion of audiences, and how do I link them together? And I wasn't really able to do that while you did. I have a couple of comments. It struck me when you talk about the thin language of emotions in folktales. I mean, of course, I agree with Yuti, and I agree with how you're presenting that. But I also see that language of emotion as an embodied language. So we don't hear about the emotion, but we hear about the crying, the running, the backing away, the words that the characters speak. So those are all kind of actions, as you were saying, and some of them are extreme, but they're also just the embodiment of an emotion. So I wanted your response to that, and also in relation to your placing or your return to the oral setting, right, as the one where we see that transference, if you want, of emotion through the narrator from characters to the audience. I love that. But I also see that other media can work with the emotion, with the emotions of the folktale, let's say. And you showed some examples from film and artifacts and so on, right? So because those emotions are embodied in the folktale, we can also see them. We imagine them visually. And that visualization, which is active in film or in comics or graphic novels and so on and so forth, and visual art, is available to the audience in these other media. Am I making myself clear? So those are my comments that I'd like your response to.
Okay, thank you, Christina. Thank you so much. Well, I do think that in your paper you were able to address these issues in a very significant manner. I must say that after your first comment, I missed your second and third comments or questions if there were, because there was some break in the audio. But I will start with what I hear. And your first comment was regarding. Could you repeat that? Sorry. I've had some
just
breaks.
That the emotions are not described,
embodiment,
but the actions embody the emotions.
Yeah. I think, embodiment here is a very good concept to work with. And that's exactly where I think the emotion becomes visible. And that is exactly why I had this slide with various images, because whenever visually the folk narrative is interpreted by visual artists, the emotion is so strongly present in every representation. And I think that's because the emotion of the tale is getting across with a thin language of emotion, but it is getting across. And therefore, yes, and it is embodied. I fully agree with you, and I think that's a fantastic concept to work with. Yeah, I missed your second and third comment. So
it's just related to what you were saying now. that through the visualization of these emotions, other media are able, it's not an oral setting anymore, but other media, visual media are able to convey that emotion.
Right.
Thank you, Christina. Now we have Evelina to pose a question, please.
First of all, thank you for really great lecture, and it was and especially for some insightful concepts like comprehensive justice, for example, in the end. And I have one short question. It's about detail. You said you talked about dominant emotion. But sometimes it's not very clear how that determine which is the dominant emotion. Do one inscript it in the content of the tale, or do one produce in a narrative situation? That is not always consistent with the content of the narrative. For example, some great storytellers humorously twist the set content of the story itself with their gestures, or the others, while they are narrating very frightening belief narrative, at the same time they are winking to the audience, inverting the meaning of the story by single gesture.
Yeah, thank you, Evelina, for that very wonderful question and observation on it. And you've actually added on to something that I hinted at. And the thing here is the emotion in the narrative text and the emotion, that the way the narrator is playing with it. Now, these are two strands interweaving. So there may be one dominant emotion in the narrative, but then how that dominant emotion is actually portrayed. And your fantastic example of a very frightening story, and the narrator is also signaling another attitude to it. Now, this is part of the live tradition, and I think in print that tradition then becomes part of interpretation. But in other media, in new media, this feature of the text, the duality of emotion in representation in the text and in the narrative, it has come back. It has been there in cinema, and it can be even further. Several layers can be added to it through new media. So I also feel that with the new media, there's a kind of return of orality, in another form, in another way, that there is a kind of return of orality, and many forms of oral communication and cultural expression are actually possible to be duplicated, replicated, So yes, that's a fantastic comment that you had there. That what is the dominant emotion? Is it really one, or does it shift within the text and between the text and the narrator, and perhaps also the audience, So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Please, Swathi Sudkaran, are you with us?
Thank you for your wonderful talk. I have a question about justice that you mentioned, morality, the question of justice and morality in folk tales. I was just wondering about what Ramanujan said about, him, about the Kannada folk tales he had collected, and the concept of Talavidhi, that things are written on your head, that this Talavidhi, which literally translates to what's written on your head, an absence of karma, a causality to, in a way, if there's a shattering of justice, because a few folk tales I've read also talk about people, cheating each other and getting away with things, and the tale always ends with they live happily ever after. Whether so is there an absence of morality, or in some sense, a shattering of rationality itself, of causal relations in folk tales. Yeah, that was my question.
Okay, thank you. If I understood you right, then what you are saying is that is there an absence of morality? Because yes, all kinds of trickery is performed and gotten away with, right? I mean, yesterday we had an entire panel on African folk narrative on Ananse and beyond. And Ananse is a trickster, and there are tricksters in every, I think, in every folk narrative culture and tradition. And tricksters are able to do and get away things, but also not always. At times they are brought to the book. And moreover, tricking in African narrative, this trickster was such a prominent figure that the colonial British collectors interpreted it as saying that because people tell so many tricks about tricksters and laugh at them and enjoy them, they are themselves immoral. They are themselves people full of tricks, etc. So this kind of straight connection is very dubious and is very problematic in itself. How tales are playing with the mind is a very deep question. And at times, talking about immorality is another way of talking about morality. I certainly do not feel that folk narrative on a general basis does not care for morality. I think it does care for morality and several kinds of morality and very complex nature of morality. Also, it is able to deal with. Yeah, so, and the same stands for justice, that folk narrative sense of justice is not simply rational justice. It is not justice only as per some rules and regulations. It is justice which is very specific to the situation per se. It is able to take note of huge dilemmas and still talk of justice. So that simple situation, which is often cited as simple, happily ever after, it's a very complex situation because it is reached through a very complex process. So yes, to answer briefly, I think if I understood your question right, both justice and morality and morals are important to folk narrative, but not in a straight manner, not in the sense of, the way a kind of a religious class happens about moral science and things like that, not in that sense. But folk narrative does engage with the question of morals, morality, and justice.
Thank you.
Thank you, Swati. Vivian, could you please join us with your comment or question?
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Sadhana, for this presentation. I'll be thinking about it a lot. It was very interesting. I agree with you that maybe we have to see the story not only through the words, but also through what we feel about it, and also about what is represented in images in the tale itself. And I was wondering if you could go a little bit further in your idea that some emotions could be more specific to some tales. And it's right, the hero who doesn't fear, feel fear, it's one. I was reminded also of maybe the princess who will not laugh, or there might be many, so it would be interesting to explore that a bit more. And then I just want to share something about the duration of happiness. Somehow, in my experience with tale-tellers in French Canada, I've been struck by the observation of one tale-teller who said the tales were tales of misery because there's no happiness in them. And she said they're happy only 5 minutes in the end. So to her, it was not happily ever after, but just a little moment. And in the end of the tale, as if something else was going on afterwards. And I was thinking with your idea of the audience, that actually in wakes, in evenings where people would tell tales together, actually at the end of the tale, there was this 5 minutes, and then you're back in another tale and trouble again. So I was thinking that maybe the realm of this eternity of happiness is the realm of now. It can be eternal, but only now, somehow. So it came to me. I had never thought about that this way, but well, that's the few things I wanted to share. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vivian, and thank you very much for that comment. Thank you.
There are some more questions. Nimeshika, Venkatasan.
Hello, Professor Naithani. So it was fascinating to listen to your, I think my video is not working, but I hope I'm audible. It was fascinating to listen to your lecture, and the emotion mapping that you did was inspired. I mean, it's fantastic. So I was actually thinking about this when it's not so much of a question, but like a comment, and I would like to know what you think about it. But when we talk about fairy tales, and I remember as a kid when my grandfather used to tell me tales, there was the story of the Little Red Riding Hood, and then the story of the Three Little Pigs, which I read growing up in my little fairy tales book. And that has very obvious, especially in the storytelling aspect of it, there are these dramatic enactments. And when we consider this entire genre of storytelling that exists now, where people tell stories, emotion really comes into place. So in that sense, the more, for that matter, if I was to discuss the Little Red Riding Hood, and as Jack Zipes mentioned in the rereading of the Little Red Riding Hood, that it was a peasant's tale it was a cautionary tale about rape of peasant women that was initially told, which means that it should have been loaded with a lot of social significance, as you had mentioned. So I was wondering, what is this, if there is a change of attitude in the reception of emotions when it comes to fairy tales, when it is directed towards a younger audience, that is to children, and when it is directed towards adults, if that makes any sense.
Thank you, Nimeshika. I don't know if I exactly got your question. Could you repeat the last bit, please?
Yes, Professor. What I'm trying to say is bordering on this idea of reception, of how reception theory, and how we understand how the audience interprets the tale in the context of like fairy tales, especially. Perhaps there is a difference in the reception, especially when the tale is directed to children, that emotions are more evident in the sense that it becomes like a thick emotion, and then when it is directed towards adults, somehow that emotion is made more subtle in the way the story is narrated.
Okay. Nimeshika, thank you for that question. But I do think that in the narration for children, actually action is more highlighted. And that's how your attention is engaged. In fact, if you see the folk narrative was constructed as children's literature, but it was not essentially children's literature, it was adults. And we see that also in, for example, in the telling of the epics, how we receive epics as adults and how we receive epic stories as children. As children, you quite often miss that depth of emotion or dilemma so it is the action that speaks more, I think, when the narration is for children, whereas more contemplative interpretation is for a more adult audience. Hope that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Nimeshika. There are some other comments or questions. I can find any in chat. I just want to ask you, Sadhana, do we actually need the conception of poetical justice? Hmm?
Do we actually need it?
Yeah, do we actually need it? What it will be poetical justice connected only to story realm or?
Since it has been around for so long, I think we must have needed it. You know, we as human beings must have needed it. And now when I think of folk narrative with reference to justice, I come to, and I'm actually writing on it at probably a more developed kind of an argument there, that actually poetic justice is the form of justice through which the common people end up talking about justice, not law, not judges, not all that, but how do common people come to talking about justice? It is through their engagement with stories. It might have been oral folk narrative, or it might be the Netflix series today. I mean, if you see, there is such a glut of series on crimes and on emotions and on, you know, and on legalities and on the profession of lawyers, and all of them are actually they are talking about law, even profession of law. But who are they talking about that for? That is for the general audience who are not actually lawyers. And that is how we build our very view of, I don't think I have been in a courthouse ever in my life. But I do have an image of it, you know, and I do have an image of the way lawyers would argue cases. And where have I gotten it all from? I've gotten it from stories. I don't know if a real view will be shockingly different, or will it be, you know, or were the representations very realistic? I don't know. But actually, I've seen how courts function in America. And I think through more of new media and Netflix, American concepts of court, justice, the working of the law enforcement agencies, they are becoming very universally known. I mean, I'm seeing sometimes in local Indian films and all, they are talking about things which are straight coming from Hollywood movies or from Netflix series. Indian policemen don't talk like that. They never read out their laws to you. But now they start reading out their laws to you and telling you that you have the right to remain silent, etc. So all these ideas about law, legality, justice, they are interconnected. I think for the non-professionals, for the common people in general, poetic justice is where they start. How when we in newspapers, when a crime happens, especially a crime of passion happens, you know, how are people able to say that this is right or this is not right or this is correct, where they have not read law books? What their entire system of justice is actually coming from storytelling and from listening to stories. This might include religious stories as well, but it is from listening to stories, I feel. And therefore, today I think that poetic justice has received far too little credit. And I think it requires more credit. It requires more identification, because it plays a very significant role in society and in formation of ideas about justice. That's how I think we know what justice is.
Thank you, Sadhana. I suggest that we expand actually the timing of this discussion for 5 minutes on expense of our break, because we have 2 questions by Eva and by Teresa, but please be quick.
Okay, should I speak first?
Yes, please, yes.
Am I first? Okay. Oh. Well, my question is... well, my
please,
question...
Teresa.
Okay.
Okay. We will start with Teresa.
Well, my question is in fact similar to Renate's question, and as Sadhana has already answered. But when I was listening, I was thinking about a German scholar of the 60s, André Jolas, wrote a book, Simple Forms, Einfache Formen, and one of the subjects he's interested in is justice and ethics. And and your answer, Sadhana, has to do with the difference that he establishes between the ethic of the event and the ethics of the event and the ethics and philosophical ethics. And the ethics of folk tales are ethics of the event itself, of the action itself. And he also speaks about naive morale. Well, that's what we get in folk tales, and that's very reassuring, don't you think? That's all.
Yes, Teresa. I mean, thank you very much. I mean, I'll look up Yola Einfache Formen. It's something that I haven't seen, but I would love to. And thank you for that. And I'm very happy to see you. It reminds me of that fantastic Grimm's conference in Lisbon. And you're very
thank you. Thank you.
Insightful paper there.
Please, Eva, it will be our last, I'm sorry, question.
Thank you. Sorry about the misunderstanding before. Thank you for an absolutely fantastic and inspiring talk. And I was so glad to see you coming to all the complexity of emotion. But that's not my question. Well, it is, in a sense, because I wanted to kind of ask what you think of thinking about emotions as a research tool. That is, that we as researchers use our emotional responses as almost as a methodology or part of our methods of research.
Indeed, I think you've hit the nail on the head, as they say, that of course, the researcher's emotionality is part of researching emotions. Absolutely. Thank you.
I have only one nice commentary in chat, and I suggest to read it and then that we wrap up this discussion, because we have still like 3 parallel sessions in the afternoon and then the round table. So Vivian Labrier wrote, we could talk as well about politic and poetic justice. Folk tales, in my experience, have helped join poetics and politics in everyday life and social struggles, justice struggles and grassroots work. Yes, of course.
Well, I couldn't agree more, and I couldn't say it better. So thank you, Vivian. Thank you once again.
I also would like to thank all participants and invite all of you to join our roundtable discussion at 8:30 Central European Time. It will be moderated by our colleague Terry Gunnell, and I hope that we will continue with this important discussion. Someone raised a hand? Is there? No, no. So thank you again. Thank you, Sadhana, for your wonderful lecture. And we are waiting to see and to read it in printed form. So thanks a lot and see you soon.
See you soon. Yeah.
In 2 hours. Bye.